A veteran with nothing but old tools and years of experience stands on the sidelines, ignored by a team of young technicians armed with the latest technology. When a critical mission goes awry and the helicopter begins to fail, it's not the tech that saves the day. It's the wisdom of the man everyone thought was outdated. Can Eli's knowledge of machines save the mission before it's too late? If Eli's story inspired you and reminded you that experience and wisdom are irreplaceable, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Endless Stories for more tales of heroes who prove that true knowledge transcends technology. Join us as we continue to honor the unsung legends who've saved the day when it mattered most. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and learn how experience can change everything. Fort Harrison, nestled in the misty mountains, was alive with energy that morning. The air was crisp, and the sound of helicopters reverberated through the open sky. Technicians rushed around the flight line, preparing for what was to be a critical mission, one that required precision, focus, and the fastest turnaround possible. The morning sun shone brightly, casting long shadows over the tarmac as the hum of engines filled the air. In the midst of this organized chaos stood Eli Williams, an elderly man with a quiet presence. His olive-green jacket, well-worn from decades of service, hung loosely around his shoulders. His face, lined with age, was framed by a cloud of gray hair, and his hands, though steady, bore the marks of a lifetime spent working on aircrafts during some of the most intense and dangerous operations. The younger technicians, all clad in crisp, modern uniforms, moved with urgency and precision. They ran diagnostics, checked fuel lines, and ensured the helicopters were ready for flight. Their tablets were never out of reach, their eyes never far from the screen that promised real-time solutions to every problem. But Eli stood apart from them. Unlike the tech-savvy crew, he didn't rely on gadgets or complex systems. Instead, he had brought only a small, weathered leather pouch filled with old tools that had served him well in his decades of service. He had been called back to the base after years of retirement, summoned for his experience with the helicopters. The mission was urgent, and no one had been able to solve the issue with the main rotor system of the chopper. The young technicians were confident their modern diagnostics would pinpoint the problem, but the crew was struggling to make progress. As Eli watched the crew work from the sidelines, the hum of the flight line was deafening. The helicopters were ready to go, but there was a growing sense of unease in the air. The team moved with the certainty of youth, confident in the tools they wielded. But Eli, a veteran with years of battle-tested wisdom, knew that sometimes technology didn't have all the answers. The crew didn't notice Eli at first, too consumed by their gadgets and systems. To them, Eli was nothing more than an old man, a burden who had been brought back for reasons they didn't understand. In their eyes, he was a relic of a past long forgotten, a time when technology wasn't as advanced as it was now. But Eli didn't mind. He had faced this before many times over during his years as a mechanic in Vietnam. He had been dismissed, ignored, and passed over. He had been told that his tools were outdated, his methods obsolete. But every time, his hands and his knowledge had pulled through. The young technicians worked tirelessly, their eyes glued to the bright screens of their tablets. They were confident in their training and the power of their tools. Every system was monitored, every sensor tested. The tech had never failed them before. They had been taught to trust the data, to rely on the diagnostic software that ran in real time, processing information and guiding them through any issues. The helicopter at the center of the hangar had been flagged with a malfunction in the main rotor system. The tech on Kyle's tablet showed a simple fault. Nothing too complicated. It was something they had seen before. The rotor blades were off balance, and they just needed to realign them. The diagnostics confirmed it. The problem should have been solved in minutes. Kyle, the lead technician, wasn't worried. His crew had dealt with rotor system issues countless times. He believed in the tech. He was confident that this would be another routine repair. "It's a glitch," Kyle muttered to himself as he glanced at his tablet. "Let's realign the rotor and we're good to go." His eyes moved across the hangar, resting on the old man standing silently by the hangar door. Eli hadn't said a word since he arrived, and his weathered tools, so out of place in this world of high-tech machinery, hung by his side. What could Eli possibly know that the diagnostics hadn't already told them? Kyle made a quick decision. He waved his hand dismissively. "We don't need him for this. It's basic stuff." Eli overheard, but didn't respond. He had spent years in the field, solving problems that didn't have an obvious solution. He understood the frustration of dealing with machines that refused to cooperate, and he had learned that sometimes the tools on hand were just a starting point. Sometimes it took something more. Kyle motioned for his crew to continue the adjustments. They moved with practice speed, following the readouts on their tablets as they made small changes to the rotor alignment. The minutes ticked by, but as the helicopter roared to life again, the problem wasn't fixed. The blades still wobbled. The shaking grew more violent, and the onboard diagnostics still offered no clue as to why. The technicians stared at their screens in disbelief. There was no data to explain the failure. "What the hell is going on?" Kyle muttered, slamming his tablet on the workbench in frustration. The young technician beside him tried running the diagnostics again, but the results remained unchanged. The helicopter was unresponsive, stubbornly refusing to cooperate. The more they tried, the worse it got. The rotor system shuddered violently as the engine struggled to turn over. Every adjustment made seemed to make things worse. The data couldn't explain it. The tech had failed them. Kyle glanced over at Eli, who was still standing by the hangar door. This time, Eli's eyes met his. There was no judgment in them, just a quiet understanding. Kyle's frustration boiled over. "Old man," he called out, his voice louder than necessary. "We've tried everything. What could you possibly know that we don't?" Eli slowly walked toward the helicopter, his boots silent on the tarmac. The younger technicians stepped aside, looking at him curiously. They had all assumed he was here to be a spectator, a figurehead from the past with no real use. But now, as the helicopter's engine sputtered and coughed, something changed. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hands moved quickly and efficiently, pulling out his old tools that looked almost out of place next to the sleek, modern equipment the technicians had been using. He reached into his worn pouch and pulled out a wrench that had clearly been well used. "What are you doing?" Kyle asked, though he was too curious to stop Eli. Eli didn't respond at first. Instead, he kneeled next to the rotor system, his hands moving with a precision that came from years of practice. His eyes focused on the machine, but his hands worked like they already knew the solution. The technicians watched in silence, a strange mix of doubt and awe in their expressions. The tech had failed them. Now, Eli was relying on his experience. He reached for the rotor system's access panel, an area that had been overlooked by the diagnostics. It wasn't flagged as an issue in the system, but Eli had worked with these machines long enough to know that sometimes it wasn't the obvious problems that caused failures. It was the little things that slipped through the cracks. As his wrench turned the bolts, the technicians watched in stunned silence. What was Eli doing that their gadgets hadn't been able to detect? Eli adjusted the alignment of a small mechanical part inside the rotor system, something that was impossible to detect through the digital readouts. With a final turn of the wrench, Eli stepped back and motioned for Kyle to try the engine again. Kyle hesitated, his skepticism fighting against the strange sense of hope that was creeping up. Could Eli have actually solved it? With a deep breath, Kyle climbed into the cockpit and powered up the engine. The rotors started to spin, slowly at first, then faster until they were turning smoothly. The shaking stopped. The helicopter hummed with the familiar rhythm of a machine that was finally functioning as it should. Kyle's jaw dropped. The rest of the crew stood frozen in disbelief. Eli hadn't used any tech. He hadn't run any diagnostics. He hadn't even consulted a tablet. He had simply listened to the machine and used his hands, applying knowledge that could never be measured by software. The hum of the helicopter engines filled the air, but for the young technicians it was far from a satisfying sound. They stood in a circle, eyes fixed on Eli, who was standing calmly at the center of the hangar, watching the helicopter as if he could feel its pulse. Kyle, still in disbelief, stepped back from the cockpit. The helicopter was functioning perfectly now, but he couldn't quite reconcile the result with his initial skepticism. "I don't understand," Kyle muttered, his voice laced with confusion. "The system didn't pick that up. We ran the diagnostics. Everything should have been fine." Eli didn't answer immediately. He wasn't here to explain his every move. But his calm presence spoke louder than words. He had solved the problem that no one else could. The tech had failed, but Eli had listened to the machine in a way that only years of experience could teach. Kyle's mind raced. He had been so sure, so convinced, that the future was in the tech, in the gadgets and screens that his generation had been trained to rely on. Was he wrong? "We need to take this up with the general," Kyle finally said, his frustration still evident. "The helicopter is good now, but I'm not sure how this will look. We've missed something here, and it could cost us. We can't just ignore that this problem happened in the first place." Eli, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. "It's not about ignoring the tech, son. It's about balancing it. You have the right tools, but sometimes the tools don't tell you everything. The real answers come from knowing how to work with the machines, not just from relying on a screen." Kyle didn't want to admit it, but Eli was right. The helicopter had worked fine, but it hadn't been the software that solved the problem. It had been Eli's wisdom, his decades of experience, and his ability to read the machine like a book. The young technicians, though still skeptical, began to see the wisdom in Eli's words. As they gathered around, Eli motioned for them to come closer. "The tech can help you, but only so far." Eli continued, "What you need is to understand the machine. Listen to it. Feel it. Don't just trust what the system tells you. Trust what you know." The younger technicians looked at each other, absorbing what Eli was saying. Their initial judgment of him, an old man who had been left behind by progress, was beginning to fade. "So, what do we do now?" Megan, one of the younger technicians, asked hesitantly. Eli gave a small, knowing smile. "You learn. You start by trusting your hands and ears. Then, you add the tech into the equation." Kyle stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "All right, Mr. Vance. You've got my attention. What do we do next?" His voice was a mix of humility and respect, a shift from the arrogance he had carried when he first met Eli. Eli nodded, then turned toward the helicopter. "Next, we make sure this bird is ready for the mission. But we do it together, tech and intuition. We make sure everything is in working order, not just what the system tells us. We check it with our hands, with our senses. That's how you ensure it won't fail again." The crew worked together, this time with Eli leading the way. They moved from one helicopter to the next, combining their high-tech tools with Eli's hands-on approach. Every diagnostic was verified, but each technician also checked manually, using their senses to feel the vibration of the engines, the resistance of the controls, the hum of the rotor blades. Each movement was purposeful, guided by Eli's calm presence. Kyle was no longer dismissing the old methods. As the day wore on, he began to see the truth in Eli's words. The tech was helpful, but it didn't replace the skill and intuition that came with experience. The younger technicians had always relied on data, but now they were learning how to trust their own instincts, something they hadn't been taught in their training programs. By the time the sun began to set, the helicopter fleet was ready. Each one had passed the new tests, and the crew knew that they were truly prepared for the mission ahead. The tech had its place, but the real value was in their combined knowledge, old and new. Kyle stood near the final helicopter, staring at the blades as they spun lazily in the late afternoon light. He thought back to the morning when he had been so sure of his tools and his knowledge. He had been dismissive of Eli, convinced that the old veteran had nothing to offer. But now he knew better. "Mr. Vance," Kyle called over. Eli, who had been watching from a distance, turned toward him. "Thank you for everything. We wouldn't have made it without you." Eli smiled quietly. "You'll do fine, son. You've got the tech, but now you've got the right mindset. Keep using both. The future needs the past, and the past needs the future. Never forget that." The evening sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, signaling the end of a long day at Fort Harrison. The technicians, now more thoughtful than before, moved with quiet confidence. The rotors of the helicopters beat rhythmically, cutting through the air like the pulse of the base. The young crew had learned more in the past few hours than they had in weeks. As the final checks were being completed on the helicopters, Kyle felt a shift within himself. The sense of doubt that had clouded his judgment earlier in the day had dissipated. What had once seemed old-fashioned and irrelevant now felt like the foundation of solid, reliable work. Eli had shown him and the team that experience wasn't something to be discarded. It was a valuable tool that technology couldn't replace. But the real test had yet to come. The mission they had been preparing for all day was still scheduled to take place the next morning. The crew was ready now, but a sense of unease still lingered in the air. Would Eli's approach work when it mattered most? Kyle stood near the hangar door, staring at the sky. His thoughts raced. The mission was critical. If they didn't complete it successfully, the consequences could be dire. Everything was riding on this. The pressure was mounting, and Kyle couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something would go wrong. Would the team be able to trust the new methods they had learned? As if sensing his thoughts, Eli walked up beside him. The old man didn't say anything at first, but Kyle could feel his steady presence beside him. "You're thinking about the mission, aren't you?" Eli asked, his voice low but firm. Kyle glanced at him, then nodded. "Yeah, it's a big one. We've got everything ready, but I'm still worried. I don't know if we've done enough. What if something goes wrong?" Eli gave a slight chuckle. "Worrying about the future doesn't fix the present. Son, you've done what you could. Now you have to trust what you've learned today. The machine will tell you what it needs, but you need to listen to it with your hands, not just your screens." Kyle paused, thinking over Eli's words. Trust the process. Trust the experience. But what if something unexpected happens? Kyle asked, feeling a flicker of uncertainty creep back in. What if the system fails again? Eli turned to face him, his eyes steady. It will fail. So will the tech. But that's when you'll step in. You can fix what tech can't. The problem will come. But if you've got the right mindset, you'll fix it. It's not about what you know from a tablet. It's about understanding the heart of the machine. You've got everything you need right here. He placed a hand over Kyle's chest, where his heart was. Kyle looked at the older man. There was a quiet strength in Eli's words, something that resonated deep within him. The moment felt heavy with realization. Eli had lived through battles, real battles, not just with machines but with life. "Thanks, Eli. I think I understand now. It's not just about fixing things. It's about knowing when to trust yourself, not the tech," Kyle said, a sense of clarity washing over him. Eli nodded. "That's it. Now you're ready. You've got the tools. Now use them with confidence." The morning came fast, as it always did in the military. The technicians gathered around, their uniforms neat, their minds focused. The helicopters were prepped and ready, the tech systems checked and double-checked. The pilots had briefed the crew, and now it was time to take off. Kyle stood with Megan, who had been quiet but attentive throughout the process. "Ready for this?" Kyle asked, looking over at Megan. Megan nodded, her expression serious. "I think so. We've done everything we can. But now we have to trust Eli's methods. We're not just technicians anymore. We're part of something bigger." The crew climbed into their respective helicopters, and the sound of engines roaring to life filled the air. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest as he fastened his seatbelt and powered up his controls. The mission was real now, and there was no turning back. Eli stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching the helicopters take off. He had done his part, and now it was up to the younger crew. He had taught them everything he could, but it was their turn to carry the weight. As the choppers lifted into the sky, he whispered a silent prayer for them. They would face challenges. There would be obstacles ahead, and mistakes would be made. But Eli knew one thing. They now had the knowledge, the experience, and the trust to tackle whatever came their way. The mission had begun smoothly, but it didn't take long for things to go wrong. As the helicopters flew over the rugged terrain, one of them experienced a sudden issue with the rotor system. The tech diagnostics didn't flag anything, but the vibration in the helicopter was unmistakable. Kyle's heart raced. He knew what he had to do. "Megan, Get ready to check the rotor manually, Kyle ordered, his voice calm but firm. The crew sprang into action, relying on Eli's teachings. The modern tech had failed them again, but the lessons Eli had instilled in them had prepared them for this. Megan climbed into the rear compartment, moving quickly and confidently, just as Eli had shown her. The helicopter's vibrations were worsening, and Kyle could feel the stress mounting in the controls. But instead of panicking, he trusted his gut. He guided the helicopter lower and began manually adjusting the rotor settings based on Eli's instructions. He knew exactly what to do without looking at a single diagnostic screen. The team worked together using both tech and intuition until the helicopter stabilized. "Good job, everyone," Kyle said, his voice full of relief. "We're back in control." Eli had been right all along. They had learned to trust their hands, their instincts, and their training. It wasn't the tech that saved them. It was their ability to trust themselves and each other. The day wore on, but the relief from the previous challenges was fleeting. The mission was far from over, and the helicopter fleet had more hurdles to face. The crew had managed to get through the first setback, but there was still the nagging worry that the mission might fail. Every minute, every second counted, and they all knew it. Kyle, now more confident, sat at the controls of his helicopter, monitoring the systems. His mind kept wandering back to Eli's words from earlier. "Trust your hands, not the tech." Those words had made all the difference so far. It wasn't just about running diagnostics or following protocols. It was about knowing the machine inside and out, feeling it beneath the fingers, trusting the movements, and recognizing when something was wrong. As the helicopters flew over the treacherous landscape, something unexpected happened. The transmission system in one of the helicopters began to sputter. The indicators on the dashboard flickered, showing signs of a critical malfunction. This wasn't just a minor issue. It could ground them all if not handled quickly. The tech was once again useless. The diagnostics did not show any serious issues, but Kyle could feel the change in the helicopter's behavior. Kyle's heart dropped. He glanced at Megan, who was flying the second chopper. They exchanged looks. The tension was palpable. Could they really rely on Eli's teachings again? Would it work this time? The general's voice crackled through the comms, calling for a status update. "We can't afford another failure. Get this under control now." Kyle knew what he had to do. They couldn't waste any more time relying on the system. They had learned that already. It was time to trust their instincts and Eli's teachings. "Megan, we're going to try what Eli showed us. We're going to take it down low and manually adjust the system. We can't risk the tech failing us again." Megan's voice came through the comms clear and calm. "Understood. Let's do it." They began the descent, carefully following Eli's instructions. Kyle's hands were steady, but his mind raced. This wasn't a simple fix, it was a risk. What if they got it wrong? What if the helicopter was too unstable to adjust manually? As they hovered just a few feet above the rugged terrain, Kyle turned off the digital navigation and relied on his gut. He could hear the transmission struggling in a way that no software could have described. It was a mechanical issue, not something the diagnostics had flagged. Megan, working alongside Kyle, followed his lead. They manually adjusted the power output, testing each change as they went. The rotor system groaned in protest, but they kept at it, relying on Eli's simple yet effective method of trial and error, the method he had used during the worst of times when there were no computers, no gadgets. Only the machine and the mind of the mechanic. With every turn of the wrench, every manual adjustment, the helicopter seemed to respond. The grinding noises eased, and the transmission began to hum more steadily. Slowly but surely they were fixing the problem. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy, but it was working. "Kyle, the readings are stabilizing." Megan's voice was a mix of disbelief and triumph. "We're good. We're back in control." Kyle took a deep breath. They had done it, but they still weren't out of the woods. They needed to get back in the air quickly to continue the mission. The crew had to be ready for anything. The helicopter was now stable, but who knew what else might go wrong? It was never just about fixing one thing, it was about being prepared for the next challenge. "Let's get this bird back in the air," Kyle said, his voice steady now. "We've got a job to finish." The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. The helicopter continued to perform well, but the team knew that they couldn't afford to relax just yet. The mission was still critical, and there were still plenty of obstacles ahead. As they approached the extraction zone, the weather began to worsen. Dark clouds loomed in the distance, and the wind picked up, sending ripples through the rotor blades. The storm was coming. The mission had to be completed before the storm hit. Kyle and Megan were flying side by side, coordinating the drop-off and pickup operations. The pilots were on edge, but they knew what needed to be done. They had been trained for this. They had been prepared. And then, suddenly, an issue with the communication system arose. A critical error in the transmission sent a burst of static through the radio. Kyle could barely hear the control tower, and the signal was cutting in and out. This wasn't a minor glitch. It was something that could jeopardize the entire operation. But this time, they didn't panic. They knew what to do. They had been trained to handle problems like this without relying on technology alone. Kyle called out to Megan, "We're going manual again." His voice was calm. "We can't risk the system failing in the middle of this. Stay close and keep an eye on your instruments. We've got this." They manually coordinated the drop-off using old-school methods, hand signals, visual markers, and the communication they'd learned from Eli. The helicopters moved in close formation, synchronized perfectly despite the storm and the fading tech signals. Finally, the mission was complete. The team returned to base, exhausted but victorious. The crew landed, their hearts still racing from the adrenaline of the mission. The rain began to fall as they disembarked, but they were safe. They had completed the mission against the odds. Kyle and Megan met up with the rest of the team, their faces tired but proud. Kyle approached Eli, who had been quietly observing from a distance. Eli didn't say much, but he didn't need to. "You did it, Kyle. You did it with your hands, your mind, and your heart," Eli said quietly. "You learned the most important lesson today. The tech is just a tool. The real work comes from understanding what you're working on." Kyle nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes. "We couldn't have done it without you. I'm sorry I doubted you before." Eli simply smiled. "Don't thank me. You've learned the lesson. Now pass it on." The days following the successful completion of the mission were tense at Fort Harrison. Despite the calm appearance of the military base, every technician, pilot, and officer knew that the upcoming mission was even more critical than the last. The previous day's storm had left the team on edge, but they had pulled through by relying on Eli's methods. His wisdom had not only saved them but had also opened their eyes to the vulnerabilities of over-relying on technology. Now, a new challenge awaited them. The mission was not just a routine operation. It was a high-stakes flight to extract a team of special forces trapped behind enemy lines. The team had been waiting for weeks for the weather to clear, and now the moment had arrived. It was time to act, and everything depended on their performance. The crew was already gathered, standing by their helicopters. The weather was still unstable. Clouds loomed in the distance, and the wind was picking up. Everyone was aware of the risks involved in this mission. They had just been given a second chance to prove themselves after their earlier success. But this time, the stakes were higher. As the team stood in line, Kyle glanced over at Eli, who was leaning against the wall by the hangar door, watching them with that same quiet intensity. The old man had barely spoken since the mission the day before, but Kyle knew that Eli was the reason they had been successful. It wasn't the tech or the systems. They had all learned that lesson. It was Eli's unshakable presence and his ability to stay calm under pressure. The young technicians now understood that experience was a priceless asset. "This is it, everyone," Lieutenant Wells said, walking up to the group. His voice was steady but filled with determination. "The mission is critical. There will be no room for mistakes. Our lives depend on getting this right." The team nodded, their faces grim. But in the back of their minds, they knew that their understanding of the helicopter systems had changed. They now trusted themselves and they trusted Eli. The crew climbed into the helicopters and began their pre-flight checks. The wind was now howling through the air, but the helicopter engines roared to life. The systems were checked and double-checked. Everything seemed fine. However, as soon as the helicopters started to gain altitude, something went wrong. A loud, unnerving noise filled the air. It was subtle at first, just a faint grinding sound, but it quickly grew worse. The vibration in the helicopter became more pronounced, shaking the entire structure. Kyle's heart sank as he watched the rotor system's readings on his tablet flash red. "Not again," Kyle whispered under his breath. "Not now." The helicopter began to waver, the controls becoming sluggish as the vibrations increased. Kyle quickly engaged the override controls, but the helicopter refused to stabilize. The team had just left the safety of the base, and they were rapidly losing control of the helicopter. The loud grinding noise made the situation worse. The onboard diagnostics were not registering any issues. The system was clear, yet the helicopter was clearly failing. Kyle quickly glanced at Megan, who was piloting the second helicopter. "We need to land. Now!" he barked into the comms. Megan's voice crackled through the radio. "We're not going to make it." There was a touch of panic in her tone. "The rotor system is malfunctioning." "Don't trust the tech," Kyle interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "We're doing this manually. Get ready for adjustments." Kyle turned toward the access panel and began making manual adjustments. The tech had failed them again just as it had before. But this time there was no time to waste. The tech couldn't explain what was going wrong. The crew had learned not to depend on the system. They had to fix this themselves. Eli's teachings had prepared them for moments like this. The helicopter was failing, but they had learned to trust their hands, their instincts, and each other. The helicopter's engines screamed, struggling to maintain altitude. The shaking continued, and Kyle knew they didn't have much time. They were deep in enemy territory, and if they didn't stabilize the chopper soon, it would be a disaster. Eli's face flashed in Kyle's mind. The old man had always said that in situations like this, it wasn't the tools that mattered. It was about knowing the machine. Kyle's hands worked with precision, guided by the experience Eli had taught him. He made adjustments, turning the rotor controls and recalibrating the power systems. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was the only option left. The grinding sound began to subside. Slowly, the helicopter began to stabilize. The vibrations were lessening. The shaking was no longer violent. The needle on the vibration gauge began to lower. "It's working," Kyle shouted with relief. He turned to the other technicians. "We've got it. We're good to go." As the helicopter steadied and the mission continued, Kyle could feel the weight of the past few hours lifting from his shoulders. The crew was back in control, but more importantly, they had learned something that couldn't be taught in a classroom or on a screen. They had learned that sometimes technology couldn't solve everything. There were situations where experience, intuition, and manual labor were the only answers. The rest of the team was silent over the comms, their voices full of awe. "You did it, Kyle. You saved us." Megan's voice came through, full of respect. Kyle exhaled, his heart still racing. "No, we did it. We learned from the best." As the team continued to navigate the dangerous terrain, they knew they had the skills to deal with whatever came next. They trusted the machines, yes, but more importantly, they trusted themselves. The helicopters finally reached their destination. The Special Forces team was successfully extracted without further issue. As the choppers made their way back to base, the sky began to clear, and the weather improved. The mission had been a success. When they landed back at Fort Harrison, the team gathered, their faces filled with the exhaustion of a job well done. Kyle walked over to the hangar where Eli stood, watching the crew with a quiet smile. "You did it, son. You learned." Eli's voice was steady, his approval unspoken but clear. Kyle nodded, his respect for the old man undeniable. "We couldn't have done it without you." Eli placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, his grip firm. "It was never about me. It was about you, the team, and the lessons you took to heart. Now go forward and pass it on. That's the real mission." The day after the mission, the atmosphere at Fort Harrison was different. The storm clouds had cleared, but there was a palpable shift in the air. The team had returned from their successful operation, but they had returned as different people. They weren't the same technicians who had brushed off Eli's methods and experience as outdated. They were now a team that had learned to balance the old with the new, the tech with the hands-on approach that Eli had shown them. Kyle, now in his quarters, was reviewing the helicopter diagnostics from the mission. The numbers and charts on the screen were familiar to him, but his mind kept returning to Eli's steady hands, to the way the old man had worked with the helicopter, trusting his senses and his experience rather than relying solely on technology. How many times had they overlooked the simple solutions because they trusted the tech too much? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Megan entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. "How's the head?" she asked, handing him a cup. Kyle took it gratefully, sipping the warm liquid. "It's better now. I've been thinking." He paused, his gaze distant. "We learned a lot yesterday. Not just about the machines. About each other, too." Megan nodded, sitting across from him. "You know, I never thought I'd be so thankful for an old man and a pouch full of tools." She laughed softly, but there was a trace of admiration in her voice. Kyle smiled. "Yeah, Eli showed us more than just how to fix things. He showed us how to trust our own instincts. I've never had to rely on that before, but now I know it's just as important as the tech. Maybe even more so." Megan leaned forward, her expression serious. "You think he's leaving soon?" Kyle paused. "I don't think he'll be around much longer. I'm sure he'll just slip away into the background again. That's the kind of man he is." Megan looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "I don't think he'll ever be gone, though. Not really. His lessons will stick with us forever. He didn't just teach us about fixing helicopters, he taught us about life. And that's something you can't replace." Kyle looked out the window, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the base. Eli's wisdom had already left an indelible mark on them. His quiet strength and steady guidance had been the difference between success and disaster. The tech had failed them, but Eli had given them the tools to succeed when it mattered most. The next morning, as the team gathered for their debrief, Eli was nowhere to be found. The helicopters were lined up, gleaming in the sun, ready for the day's tasks. The technicians moved about, preparing for the routine operations that lay ahead. Kyle and Megan stood by their helicopters, waiting for the briefing. Their eyes scanned the hangar, expecting Eli to appear, but he didn't. Eli had done what he came to do. He had shown them the way. Now his work here was done. There was no need for fanfare. The general walked up, a serious look on his face. He addressed the crew. "I want to take a moment to thank you all for your efforts during yesterday's mission. It was a success because of each and every one of you." He paused, scanning the faces of the team. "And I want to especially thank Eli Williams." The mention of Eli's name hung in the air for a moment, and Kyle's heart swelled with gratitude. The general continued. "Eli's experience saved this base more times than I can count. His knowledge and dedication are unmatched. We are better for having had him here." There was a murmur of agreement from the team, though Eli's absence was felt in the silence that followed. Kyle's eyes searched the hangar once more. Where was Eli? Just as the meeting was wrapping up, Kyle saw him. Eli was standing at the edge of the tarmac, his leather pouch slung over his shoulder. He was walking slowly, as if ready to fade into the background once again. Kyle didn't hesitate. He walked over to him, his voice steady and full of respect. "Mr. Vance, thank you. I don't think I can ever thank you enough for everything you've taught me." Eli turned and met his gaze. There was no grand speech, no dramatic farewell. Just a small, knowing smile. "You don't need to thank me, son. You learned the lesson. That's what matters." Kyle swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. Eli wasn't just a man from the past. He was a living reminder that the future depended on understanding where we came from. "I'll pass it on," Kyle said, his voice full of sincerity. "I won't forget what you taught us." Eli nodded, a small but genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good. That's all anyone can ask for." And with that, Eli turned and walked off, fading into the distance. The crew went on with their duties, but they had changed. They worked with a new sense of respect for the machines they maintained. They understood now that tech was just a tool, and the true art of aviation was in understanding the heart of the machine. Kyle, standing by his helicopter, felt a quiet resolve settle in. He had learned the real lesson. And as the sun set over Fort Harrison, he knew that no matter what new challenges came their way, the crew was ready. They weren't just technicians anymore. They were problem solvers, innovators, and now, they understood that sometimes the best solution was found in the wisdom of the past. Eli's legacy would live on, carried forward by the team he had changed. Eli Vance's wisdom and experience were invaluable assets that the young technicians had once dismissed. Through his hands-on knowledge, he showed them the importance of trusting their instincts and listening to the machines they worked on. It wasn't the latest tech that saved the mission, but Eli's quiet presence and his understanding of the craft. Qualities no software could replicate. In the end, it wasn't just the helicopters that were fixed, but the technicians themselves. They learned that experience, respect for the past, and the balance between technology and hands-on knowledge were the true keys to success. If Eli's story inspired you and reminded you that true wisdom doesn't come from gadgets, but from experience, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Endless Stories. Join us as we continue to honor the unsung heroes, those who pass on knowledge, and those who remind us that the future is shaped by the lessons of the past. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and stay connected with more stories of legacy, courage, and wisdom that change the world.